Imagine for a moment that you and a few friends are playing the classic game of Monopoly together. You're having a good time, you're having fun. Now, there's one small change in the rules. The banker not only gets to play this game, but he also gets to use the bank's money as if it were his own. Furthermore, imagine that this player gets to print up as much money as he wants to, should he feel the bank is running low on money. Obviously and eventually, the only possible end result of this game is that the banker who has all this limitless money will always win. So who would agree to play such a game knowing that this is the only possible end result? Well, sadly, this is happening today, right here in real life in America. Except for a few friends playing, there are millions of taxpayers, and the Federal Reserve is a player that gets to be and own the bank and eventually control everything in the world. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In 1913, Congress created the Federal Reserve. In order to be able to discuss this topic, the Federal Reserve banking system needs to be explained and understood. The Federal Reserve is the central bank of the United States, yet despite its name, it's actually a private company that was started by J.P. Morgan, William Rockefeller, the Rothschild family, and a few other individuals, who at that time in history represented over 25% of the produced wealth in the entire world. That's a lot of money. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 created and gave permission to the Federal Reserve to act in the stead of the United States government to oversee the supply of bank credit and currency in the economy. Central banks are private banks that control the nation's currency and interest rates by printing the nation's currency and by participating in economic operations within the economy. The Federal Reserve Act also allowed the Federal Reserve to issue its own Federal Reserve notes as official U.S. currency, consequently replacing the silver and gold-backed U.S. Treasury notes of the time. Also, in April 1933, FDR ordered that all gold coins and certificates in denominations of over $100 must be turned into the Fed in exchange for Federal Reserve notes for $20.67 per ounce of gold. Therefore, by April 1st of 1933, U.S. currency was no longer, until this day, is no longer backed by gold. The Federal Reserve is also the company that the U.S. government goes to when it needs to borrow money. When the U.S. government needs to borrow money, it doesn't apply for a loan like you or I would otherwise have to, but it, through the U.S. Treasury, issues debt in the form of U.S. Treasury bonds. These bonds don't have any intrinsic value themselves, but act as a promissory note that when an individual or corporation buys these bonds, that the U.S. government will pay them back plus interest in the future. Through this system, the U.S. government issues otherwise useless notes and in return gets money it can then use to fund the government. Banks such as Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, and several other foreign and domestic banks, all of which are member banks of the Federal Reserve, buy up these treasuries and then sell them to the Federal Reserve for a small profit. The Federal Reserve simply pays for all these notes by simply printing up billions of dollars out of thin air and giving it to its Federal Reserve member banks in exchange for the notes. Now, what happens when it's time for the U.S. government to pay back the Federal Reserve on these notes? Well, more likely than not, it ends up borrowing more money than it got back in return, so it has to incur more debt to pay off its original debt. Meanwhile, the Federal Reserve and its member banks get paid for their services by simply printing up billions of dollars out of thin air. Now, given all this, it needs to be understood that all Federal Reserve notes in circulation today are owned by the Federal Reserve and not anyone else. They are debt certificates. Remember how the Federal Reserve prints up, for the most part, prints up new Federal Reserve notes when the government needs to borrow more money. Well, the government then uses these notes and spends them in the economy for goods, services, military, etc. These notes continue to be circulated through the economy as people like you and me are willing to accept them as payment for our transactions and the services and goods we provide in the economy. And ultimately, these Federal Reserve notes get circulated throughout the entire economy. I'm sure everyone here has a few dollars in their pockets. But when it comes down for the government to pay back the Federal Reserve, again, what happens? They can't just take back all the U.S. Federal Reserve notes because they don't hold them anymore because they already spent them on goods and services. They can't pay the Federal Reserve back in gold or silver either because it gave most of their gold and silver to the Federal Reserve years ago as well. So again, we see that the U.S. government has to borrow more debt in order to pay off its original debt, still leaving all the Federal Reserve notes in circulation being representations of the amount of debt that the federal government still owes to the Fed. Now, the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 also requires that all nationally chartered commercial banks in the U.S. must own stock in the Fed and are considered to be member banks of the Fed. This means that most every bank in the United States operates under the Federal Reserve and its owners, thereby creating a type of banking monopoly. These banks also are allowed to, according to the Federal Reserve Act, are allowed to practice what is known as fractional reserve banking. Fractional reserve banking, as explained by Ben Bernanke in his book Macroeconomics, is when a bank holds reserves that are less than the total amount of its clients' deposits. Fractional reserve banking currently only requires the bank to hold 3 to 10% of its clients' deposits in reserve. Fractional reserve banking also, through money multiplying operations, allows the bank to loan up to 10 times the total amount of its clients' deposits. So, for example, if 10 people each put $10 into a bank, and this bank has $100 on its books. Fractional reserve banking in this situation, according to what Ben Bernanke's information, is this bank only has to hold $3 to $10 physically in its vaults, and it's allowed to loan up to $1,000 in loans to other clients. Yes. Also, the Federal Reserve also manipulates the economy by raising and lowering the federal discount rate. The federal discount rate is the interest rate that the Federal Reserve charges its member banks on money the member banks borrow from the Fed. Member banks borrow from the Fed at this low rate, currently less than 1%, whenever they need to increase the amount of reserves they have on deposit, which, according to fractional reserve banking, will allow them to exponentially increase their lending. Now, although the money that the Federal Reserve and its member banks extends is fiat or literally made up, the money that consumers like you and I have to pay back to the Fed is very real in that we only obtain that money through our actual production and labor in the economy. Through this system, the Federal Reserve, through its Federal Open Market Committee, or FOMC, tries to make predictions about the U.S. economy, and it sets the federal discount rate accordingly. For example, if the Federal Reserve feels that inflation is imminent or that the economy is growing too fast for itself, it will increase its federal discount rate, which will then require its member banks to increase the interest rates on their loans, which will then make it harder for consumers like you and me to take out those loans and pay them back, thus creating the economy to slow down. Oppositely, if the Federal Reserve feels that deflation is imminent or that the economy is slowing down too much, it will lower its federal discount rate, which will then allow its member banks to lower the interest rates on their savings accounts, which will then allow more consumers like you and me to take out loans and pay them back, to, for argument's sake, buy a new house or a car, or to expand our business, thereby stimulating the economy. Now, all this is the Federal Reserve Banking System 101. And I think it's clear that the Federal Reserve holds a massive amount of unjust license and authority over the U.S. economy, and therefore I believe the Federal Reserve needs to be abolished in order to return economic peace and prosperity to the American economy. First off, the Federal Reserve needs to be abolished because it is a cartel that robs people of their labor by devaluing the dollar. Quote, the Federal Reserve System is the primary reason why our national debt is 5,000 times larger than it was 100 years ago, and why our currency is only worth 4% of what it was also 100 years ago, end quote. Clearly, the Federal Reserve is the main cause of the massive amounts of inflation in this country. This is the case because as the Federal Reserve prints up money out of nothing, while also not providing any new commodity or technology in the marketplace, the technology and goods and commodities in the marketplace presently, necessarily the price of those goes up in order to stay at an equilibrium with this new artificial credit that's being pumped into the economy by the Federal Reserve. Now you might be asking yourself, what's wrong with this system? If, as long as there's an equilibrium between these two factors, shouldn't everything be fine? Well, no. Inflation is bad in that it does not allow consumers like you and me to be financially responsible. In fact, Ron Paul said in his book, "And the Fed," quote, the Federal Reserve encourages irresponsible accumulation of personal debt. People live beyond their means, they trade in their futures for the present, and they neglect the need to save in order to spend more and more, end quote. With the Federal Reserve banking system, there's actually a de-incentive for consumers like you and me for saving our money. For example, let's say a gentleman has $10, and inflation caused by the Federal Reserve is, according to Federal Reserve data, and CNBC is actually around 6 to 10% annually, not the advertised 1 to 2%. This means that the gentleman in this example, his $10 in a year from now will only be able to buy what $9 can buy presently. Now, this might not seem like much of a loss to this gentleman, nonetheless it is still unnecessary, and unfair. Also, it's interesting to note that according to CNN Money, the highest savings account interest rate today in America is less than 1%, with the average being far less than that. It's interesting to see how the banks who are part of and own the Fed don't give out interest rates that would allow people like you and me to come anywhere close to competing with the actual rate of inflation. Therefore, in all of this, we see that the gentleman in this example would be better off to spend his money now, considering it can actually buy him $10 worth of goods, whereas if he saves his money, which is an otherwise biblical principle, he's only going to be able to buy fewer and fewer goods every year. Therefore, we see how the Federal Reserve devalues the dollar and causes a Therefore, we see how the Federal Reserve robs us of our labor by devaluing the dollar and causing inflation. Secondly, the Federal Reserve needs to be abolished because it operates an unjust and corrupt banking system. Remember how the Federal Reserve gets to print up billions of dollars out of thin air. Well, lately, the Federal Reserve doesn't even do that. It either has the U.S. Treasury print up all its money for it, or better yet, it just electronically creates the money into the accounts of its member banks. Just like the players in a corrupt game of Monopoly would witness the banker using everyone else's assets to pay for his own expenses, and furthermore printing up as much money as he wants, it should be obvious to all who are aware of this scam just how unjust and economically sickening this monetary policy is. Also, the Federal Reserve is very corrupt within its own internal affairs. Take, for example, the CEO of Morgan Chase was allowed to serve on the board of directors of the Fed at the same time when his bank received over $400 billion in financial bailout money from the Fed. Also, William Dudley, the president of the Fed, was allowed to hold massive amounts of stock in AIG, General Motors, and General Electric at the same time when those banks received billions of dollars of bailout money from the Fed. Therefore, in this, we see that the Federal Reserve is no more than a family of crooks pretending to be a legitimate lending agency. Therefore, this is the second reason why the Federal Reserve needs to be abolished. Thirdly, the Federal Reserve needs to be abolished because it removes a major financial deterrent for entering wars. Since the Federal Reserve was enacted in 1913, the U.S. has been directly involved in over 10 wars and has backed countless other countries and groups in their own wars, militarily and financially. Now, of course, there is a time and a place for war, and the Bible in Ecclesiastes 3:8 supports this. However, with the Federal Reserve, lawmakers are not required to be financially responsible. In fact, with the Federal Reserve, lawmakers feel that if the slightest hint of conflict arises anywhere in the world, they can simply borrow an almost limitless amount of money from the Fed in order to become militarily involved. In fact, Ron Paul said in reference to World War I, quote, "Scholars estimate that only 21% of the entire war was funded through taxation." Prior to the Federal Reserve, it was very necessary for a people to take into consideration the financial burdens that would come about from entering a war, i.e. people like you and me would not be eager to go to war unless it was very necessary in protecting America and her people, because war is expensive. However, with the Federal Reserve, we've ultimately allowed ourselves to become involved with several unnecessary, drawn-out, and ultimately unsuccessful wars, as exampled by the Vietnam War and the countless engagements we've been involved in the Middle East since the 1980s. Therefore, for these three reasons, the Federal Reserve needs to be abolished. Now, it's likely that some people in this room would disagree with me. They say that without the Federal Reserve, inflation and unemployment would be worse off than they are now. Quote, "The primary job of the Federal Reserve is to control inflation while avoiding a recession. It does this through its monetary policy," end quote. People feel that when the Federal Reserve prints currency and controls interest rates, as I explained earlier in my thesis, that it gives breathing room for the economy, which is beneficial for both employees and employers alike. However, this is not true. Since the Federal Reserve was enacted, evidence only shows that inflation has skyrocketed. The idea that the Federal Reserve accurately controls inflation is a ludicrous idea. All relevant true evidence points to the fact that if the Federal Reserve were abolished and the free market were allowed to run within the principles that America was founded upon, then given the new technology and access to natural resources that modern companies here in America have today, Americans should be realizing even cheaper, more easily accessible goods, not the other way around. Also, according to data provided by the Federal Reserve on its very own website, from 1800 to 1913, years in which there was no Federal Reserve and only a short-lived national bank, there was actually deflation of the dollar. This deflation, though, being a result of economic and industrial progress in this era that led for cheaper goods to be mass-produced, leading way to an increased standard of living for Americans with a decreased cost of living for Americans. Therefore, we see that the so-called overseers of the U.S. economy, the Federal Reserve, only creates an economy that's riddled with inflation, whereas a free market economy leads to economic prosperity and peace. Secondly, people do not wish to abolish the Federal Reserve because they feel a gold standard would have to be implemented, and they feel that this gold standard would be entirely ineffective or at the very least inefficient. For example, the problem that the world faces today is that the supply of gold was less than 3% last year. Thus, there is too little growth in the supply of gold to facilitate the growth in trade of international goods and services, end quote. In other words, people feel there's not physically enough gold in the world to facilitate a gold standard. Also, they cite evidence like, quote, if one is to argue that gold cannot be inflated, one must also argue that all transactions must take place using physical specie. Clearly, this presents a problem in our digital age. Imagine trying to buy something off of Amazon.com. You would first have to place your order electronically and then send your gold coins to the seller. There could also literally be no digital accounts of this transaction if you wanted to ensure it can either be co-opted or inflated, end quote. Now, these are good concerns to have, however, they're misplaced. First and foremost, when addressing this issue, it needs to be understood that the current monetary policy of the United States, i.e. the Federal Reserve banking system, is fiat, immoral, and ultimately not working. Therefore, it is of paramount importance that we change our currency and monetary policy to be represented by a commodity, because commodities like gold or aluminum are always going to be the same and aren't subject to arbitrary inflation because they're physically there in the economy. Gold, with this understanding, gold has been used throughout history as a currency. This is the case because gold is pretty, it's rare, it's easy to weigh and measure, and the gold in Alaska is the same stuff as gold in India. However, the ultimate reason why gold has been used effectively as a currency throughout history is because people value gold. If people did not value gold, it would not be that valuable, of course, and would not be that efficient to use as a currency. However, with this understanding, it becomes evident that in order for currency to work, it simply needs to be based off of a physical commodity, whether that be gold, aluminum, or even frozen concentrated orange juice. The federal government's only job regarding this issue, according to Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution, is to coin money, assess its value, and punish the counterfeit of it. That's it. The free market will handle the rest, and it is irrelevant how much gold physically exists in the world, as gold in a gold standard is only used as a measuring rod by which anything else's value in the economy is assessed or termed in, like cubic feet of water in a pool. If someone wishes to buy 1,000 acres of land, he can use gold in this transaction, but he's not limited to only using gold in this transaction in the gold standard. He can use any other commodity or service he has, which can be represented using dollars, which are based off of a specific amount of gold in this transaction. Therefore, the idea that there's not physically enough gold in the economy to support a gold currency is irrelevant and false. Secondly, the idea that a gold standard is inefficient is a good concern to have, but again, is misplaced. With a gold standard, people could still use credit cards, checks, cash money, even electronic transfer of funds. However, the only difference between those transactions in a gold standard and the transactions that are taking place currently in the fiat currency system is that all those transactions would be based in a physical value of gold. It would not, again, be subject to arbitrary inflation or the whims of the Federal Reserve and its owners. Let's get that one. Fast forward to today, when our money is based off of nothing, inflation is running rampant, and our currency is worth absolutely nothing. So it's obvious that a gold standard would work and would be effective to use and replace the Federal Reserve monetary system. Therefore, in conclusion, the Federal Reserve is a private cartel that is immoral, unconstitutional, and economically sickening, that encourages people like us and the government to become entrenched with massive amounts of debts that can never be paid back, and is the major cause of the massive amounts of inflation that have plagued the U.S. economy since its inception. And therefore, the Federal Reserve banking system needs to be abolished, and our currency needs to be changed to a constitutional commodity-based currency, whether that be gold, aluminum, or even kilowatts of electricity.